Imagine being sea-led, inside 30 tons of American steel, rumbling across a field in Normandy, knowing one thing that no recruitment poster ever told you. One hit, just one, and the ammunition stacked beside your knees could turn your tank into a furnace in less than 10 seconds. No time to scream, no time to pray, barely enough time to pop the hatch and throw yourself into the dirt before the whole machine erupted in a column of flame visibly for miles. That was the reality for the men who crewed the M4 Sherman tank. And while history remembers the Sherman as the workhorse that won the war, the veterans who survived inside it remember something else entirely. They remember the fire. If stories like this matter to you, real stories about real men who faced impossible odds, take a moment to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. We dig into the forgotten corners of military history so these sacrifices are never erased. Now, let me take you inside the most produced American tank of the Second World War and the design flaw that turned it into a death trap. The M4 Sherman tank has earned its place in the pantheon of Allied victory. Between 1942 and 1945, American factories produced 49,324 of them, more than any other tank in the Western arsenal. They rolled off assembly lines at 10 major manufacturing plants, from the Fisher Body Works in Grand Blanc, Michigan, to the Chrysler facility in Detroit. They fought in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, and across the Pacific. They were shipped to the British under Lend-Lease, driven by Free French forces, and even served with distinction in Soviet armored corps. The Sherman outnumbered German Tiger tanks by more than 30 to 1. And there was good reason for that confidence. The Sherman was mechanically reliable in ways that made German tankers weep with envy. While a Panther might break down after 100 miles on the road, a Sherman could be driven by virtually anyone who knew how to operate a clutch. It was fast, capable of 26 miles per hour on level ground. It was easy to repair in the field. Its standardized parts meant that a wrench that fit one Sherman fit them all. It was roomy enough for a 5-man crew to work efficiently. And its large, spring-loaded hatches gave crewmen a fighting chance to escape if the worst happened. But the worst happened far too often. When British tankers in North Africa first took the Sherman into combat at the Second Battle of El Alamein in Lach in 1942, they noticed something deeply troubling. When a German anti-tank round punched through the Sherman's armor, the tank didn't just stop, it burned. Not the slow, smoldering burn of a fuel leak, but a sudden, violent eruption of white-hot flame that engulfed the fighting compartment in seconds. The fire was so fierce, so instantaneous, that crews often had no chance to evacuate. Those who did escape frequently emerged with horrific burns that marked them for life. The British crews began calling the Sherman by a grim nickname, the Ronson, after the famous cigarette lighter brand. The document behind the name was unmistakable. The Ronson lighter was advertised as the world's greatest lighter. And to the men who fought inside the Sherman, their tank lit up with the same terrible reliability. Polish tank crews, who served with distinction alongside the British in Normandy, had their own name for it. They called it the burning grave, a phrase that left nothing to the imagination. The Germans, who referred to British soldiers as Tommies, gave it at another epithet, the Tommy Cooker. On every front, in every language, the same dark truth was spoken aloud: the Sherman burned. But here is what most people get wrong about the Sherman's fire problem. The popular myth, repeated in documentaries, in Hollywood films, and even in General Patton's own press conferences, blamed the gasoline engine. The thinking was simple: gasoline burns, diesel doesn't. Therefore, the Sherman burned because it ran on gas, while German tanks supposedly ran on diesel. This was completely false. The vast majority of German tanks, the Panzer IV, the Panther, the Tiger, all ran on gasoline engines, just like the Sherman, and the Sherman used the same ordinary 80-octane fuel as every other vehicle in the United States Army. When researchers after the war examined knocked-out Shermans, they repeatedly found something surprising. The fuel tanks were often intact. The gasoline had not ignited. The real killer was not gasoline, it was the ammunition. Every Sherman carried a devastating quantity of explosive ordnance inside its hull. A standard 75mm armored Sherman held up to 100 rounds of main gun ammunition. Each round contained over 2 kilograms of propellant, a substance specifically engineered to burn rapidly and with extreme intensity. That propellant was the ticking time bomb inside every early Sherman tank. And the way it was stored was the fatal flaw that turned probability into catastrophe. In the early production models of the M4 Sherman, ammunition was stowed in the sponsons, the protruding bulges on either side of the hull, directly above the tracks. This was the most exposed and vulnerable portion of the tank's body. The armor on the sponson sides was among the thinnest on the vehicle. Any anti-tank round that struck the Sherman from the side, the most common angle of attack in the close quarter fighting of the hedgerows, the Italian mountains, and the shattered cities of Germany, had a direct path into the ammunition bins. When an armor-piercing shell penetrated the sponson wall, the physics of destruction were merciless. The round did not need to strike a shell directly. The impact sent white-hot fragments of metal called spall, spraying through the interior at thousands of feet per second. Those fragments tore into the exposed propellant charges like matches striking tinder, one round ignited. Then the heat and pressure set off the next and the next. Within seconds, the entire ammunition load could detonate in a chain reaction that transformed the Sherman into a steel crematorium. American military testing confirmed the nightmare in stark terms. Trials conducted during the war showed that when a fully loaded Sherman with no fuel aboard was penetrated, 90% of the hits to the fighting compartment caused a fire. Ammunition alone, without a single drop of gasoline, was enough to destroy the tank and kill its crew. Standard carbon dioxide fire extinguishers proved completely ineffective against propellant fires. Only massive quantities of water could suppress them, and there was no water system inside the tank. A United States Army study concluded that between 60 and 80% of early dry-stowage Shermans burned when their armor was penetrated. British historian John Buckley, studying the 8th and 29th Armored Brigades during the Normandy campaign, found that of 166 Shermans knocked out in combat, 94, 56.6%, burned out entirely. A separate American survey placed the overall burnout rate at 65%. For the men inside those tanks, the statistics translated into a simple and terrifying equation. If you were hit, the odds were better than even that you would burn. So why did the United States military allow this to continue? The answer lies in a cold calculation that prioritized industrial output over individual survival. The Sherman was never designed to be the best tank on the battlefield. It was designed to be the most producible. The entire philosophy behind the M4 was rooted in logistics. The tank's height, width, and weight were all constrained so that it could cross standard bridges, travel on existing roads, fit onto railroad flat cars, and load into the holds of Liberty ships bound for every theater of the war. Standardized parts and interchangeable components allowed different factories to produce the same basic vehicle simultaneously. A wrecked Sherman could be towed to repair, depot a few miles behind the front lines, and return to service within 24 hours. This was the doctrine of attrition arithmetic. American war planners understood that they would lose tanks, many tanks, in the grinding campaigns ahead. But they calculated that, as long as they could produce replacements faster than the enemy could destroy them, the math would favor the Allies. And in that calculation, the individual tank and the individual crew became a variable in an equation, not a life to be preserved at all costs. Germany produced roughly 6,000 Panthers, 1,347 Tiger I tanks, and 492 King Tigers for the entire war. The United States produced 49,324 Shermans. The strategy was not to build a better tank. It was to build an overwhelming number of good enough tanks. But good enough came at a price measured in human flesh. The 3rd Armored Division, the legendary Spearhead Division, provides the most devastating illustration of what that price looked like. They were the first American division to enter Belgium, the first to breach the Siegfried Line. The first to capture a German city. From Normandy to the Elbe, the Spearhead spent 231 days in continuous combat, from the nightmare of the hedgerows to the Battle of the Bulge to the final drive across the Rhine. In that time, they lost 2,540 soldiers killed, 7,331 wounded, and had 632 Sherman tanks destroyed, more tank losses than any other American armored division in the entire war. They took 76,720 German prisoners. Their commanding general, Major General Maurice Rossi, was himself killed by German forces near Paderborn in the spring of 1945, a man who led from the front and paid the ultimate price for it. Behind those numbers were individual horrors that no after-action report could fully capture. And then there was the Panzerfaust. If the dry-stowage design was the flaw, the Panzerfaust was the instrument that exploited it with devastating efficiency. This single-shot, man-portable anti-tank weapon was Germany's answer to the overwhelming tide of Allied armor. It cost less than 25 Reichsmarks to produce, roughly the price of a good pair of boots. It required almost no training. A Hitler youth conscript could fire one. And its shaped charge warhead could penetrate up to 200 millimeters of armor. The Sherman's side armor was barely 50 millimeters thick. The Panzerfaust could punch through it as easily as a bullet through paper. By 1944, Germany had produced millions of Panzerfausts and distributed them to every unit on the front line. Regular army, Waffen-See, Volkssturm, Militia, and even teenage conscripts defending the crumbling cities of the Reich. For Sherman crews advancing through the narrow streets of Aachen, Cologne, or the shattered villages of the Hürtgen Forest. Every doorway, every window, every pile of rubble could conceal a soldier with a weapon that could end their lives in a single shot. The effective range was short, between 30 and 100 meters, depending on the variant, but in urban combat, that was more than enough. A single infantryman hiding in a cellar could wait until a Sherman rolled it past, step out, eye at the thin sponson armor, and fire. If the Shepard charge jet struck the ammunition bins, and the odds were grimly favorable, the result was instant catastrophe. The terror was compounded in the Bocage, the ancient hedgerow country of Normandy, where sunken lands and walls of earth and root turned every field into a potential ambush site. Sherman tanks could not maneuver freely. They were channeled into narrow corridors where German anti-tank guns and Panzerfaust teams waited in prepared positions with clear fields of fire. The 1st Royal Tank Regiment lost 30 of its 34 tanks in a single engagement. Across the British sector, the Guards Armoured Division lost 75% of its tanks in just 2 months of fighting. The field commanders knew, the veteran tankers knew. Reports flowed up the chain of command documenting the horrific casualty rates and the link between ammunition stowage and crew deaths. Veteran tank commanders wrote blistering assessments that were filed, forwarded, and too often ignored. And yet, the bureaucratic machinery of wartime procurement moved with agonizing slowness. The first attempted fix was crude. 1-inch thick applique armor plates were welded to the sponson sides over the ammunition bins. But tests and battlefield experience raised serious doubts about whether this added steel made any meaningful difference against high-velocity anti-tank rounds. The real solution did not arrive until February 1944, when Lati production M4 A3 models began rolling off the line with a fundamentally redesigned ammunition storage system. The engineers called it wet storage. The concept was as simple as it was overdue. All main gun ammunition was moved from the exposed sponsons down to the hull floor, the lowest and most protected part of the tank. The storage bins were then encased in hollow altar jackets filled with a mixture of water and glycerin. If an anti-tank round penetrated the hull and struck the ammunition bins, the liquid would flood over the breached area, smothering the propellant before it could ignite the neighboring rounds. The designation told the story. The M4 A3 76, W standing for wet stowage, became the standard for all new production Shermans from mid-1944 onward, and the results were nothing short of revolutionary. A United States Army study in 1945 concluded that only 10 to 15% of wet stowage Shermans burned when penetrated, compared to 60 to 80% of the older dry stowage models. That single engineering change, moving the ammunition and wrapping it in liquid, reduced the fire rate by roughly 75%. It was not a marginal improvement. It was the difference between a machine that killed its own crew and one that gave them a fighting chance to survive. Think about that for a moment. Moving the shells from the side of the hull to the floor and wrapping them in liquid. That was it. That was the engineering breakthrough that saved hundreds, perhaps thousands, of American lives. Not a new gun, not thicker armor, not a revolutionary engine, a change in where the ammunition sat and what surrounded it. The technology was not exotic. It was water and glycerin in a metal jacket, And that is perhaps the most bitter truth of the Sherman story. The Ronson reputation, the burning, the dying, the horror, was not an inevitable consequence of war. It was a consequence of design. A design that could have been changed sooner. A design that should have been changed sooner. The technology to save those men existed. The engineering was straightforward. What was lacking was the institutional will to prioritize crew survival over production quotas and logistical convenience. Every month of delay cost lives that did not need to be lost. The veterans who survived the early Shermans carried those memories for the rest of their lives. Gustavus, a World War II veteran who witnessed Sherman versus Tiger combat near the town of Nennig, Germany, described the experience in terms that still cut through the decades. He recalled seeing men emerge from their tanks engulfed in flames. He watched an 88mm round reduce a Sherman to nothing but smoke and fire. These were not statistics to him. They were the faces of men he knew. The psychological toll was immeasurable. Tank crews in Normandy suffered casualty rates that historian Stephen Zaloga estimated at 80%. Replacement crews were rushed to the front with minimal training, thrown into machines they barely understood, and sent into combat alongside strangers. The experienced crews who could have mentored them were already dead or evacuated with wounds. Every time a Sherman crew buttoned up their hatches and hauled toward the enemy, they did so knowing the odds. They knew about the ammunition. They knew about the fire. They had seen what happened to the crew ahead of them in the column, and they climbed inside anyway. That is not ignorance. That is courage of the highest order, the kind of courage that history too often forgets to honor. It is important to say this clearly. The M4 Sherman was not a bad tank. In many aspects, it was an extraordinary achievement of American industrial might. Its mechanical reliability, its ease of maintenance, its adaptability, these qualities made it the backbone of Allied armored forces across every theater of the war. The Sherman won because there were enough of them, because they kept running, and because the men who crewed them refused to quit. After the wet stowage modification, the Sherman's crew survival hatch actually became one of the best of any tank in the war, thanks to those large hatches and that roomy interior. But none of that erases the fact that thousands of young Americans burned to death inside their own tanks because of a design flaw that took too long to fix. The dry-stowage Sherman was a machine that asked its crews to place their bodies next to unprotected explosives and trust that the thin walls of the sponson would hold. When those walls failed, and they failed with terrible regularity, the cost was paid in the most horrific currency imaginable. The next time you see an M4 Sherman in a museum, and there are many of them, restored and polished and standing silently in memorial parks across this country, take a moment to look at the hull, look at the sponsons above the tracks. In the early models, that is where the ammunition sat, unprotected, exposed, waiting, and then think about the 5 men who sat beside it, the driver in the front left, the assistant driver beside him, the gunner and loader in the turret, the commander standing in the cupola, scanning the horizon for threats he might never see in time. These were boys from Ohio and Texas and New York and California. They were 18, 19, 20 years old. And they went to war inside a machine that their own government knew was flawed. They went anyway, they fought anyway, and too many of them burned. This is not a story about a tank. This is a story about the men who were asked to trust, a machine that was not yet worthy of their trust and who gave everything regardless. Their courage did not fix the flaw, but it won the war, and it deserves to be remembered. If this story moved you, it'd be honored if you'd subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, tap the notification bell, and share this video with someone who cares about the real history behind the machines of war. These stories matter because the men who live them still matter. Until next time, thank you for watching, and God bless the men who crewed the Shermans.